Welcome, listeners, to a new saga from Anana's creation. Settle in as we journey into a tale of prophecy, power, and a destiny that could unravel the very fabric of an ancient order. In a place hidden from the eyes of the modern world, nestled between the highest peaks of the Rocky Mountains, lay the citadel of Ethel. It wasn't a city of stone and mortar in the traditional sense, but a sanctuary of immense power, shielded by technology and forces that defied explanation. Here, a council of elders, the Ethel, presided over a legacy stretching back millennia. They were not gods, but they were far more than human. They were the self-appointed guardians of order in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. At their head sat Chairman Owen Alden, a man whose eyes held the weight of centuries. His face, etched with lines of worry, was often fixed on the holographic projections that danced in the center of the council chamber. These projections were not stock market tickers or news headlines. They were threads of fate, complex algorithms of probability that foretold futures with chilling accuracy. For weeks, one single thread had been glowing with a menacing, crimson light. It was a prophecy Alden's ancestors had feared, a story whispered only in the most secure chambers. The prophecy of the twilight, an end brought about by a shadow in the form of a great wolf. The source of this anxiety could be traced to one man, Lucas. He was Alden's blood brother, yet they were as different as day and night. Where Alden was a bastion of order and tradition, Lucas was a master of chaos, a trickster whose cleverness was matched only by his unpredictability. He lived on the fringes of their society, dabbling in forbidden knowledge and consorting with beings the Ethel had long since cast out. It was from one of these unions that the problem arose. Word had reached the citadel that Lucas had fathered 3 children, each one an anomaly, a creature of immense and unnatural power. One was a serpent of terrifying size, another a keeper of the realm of the dead, but it was the 3rd child that haunted Alden's waking moments and stalked his dreams. It was a wolf, a pup for now, but one whose growth was alarmingly rapid. They called him Fenrir. In the council chamber, the air was thick with tension. Tyler, the stoic head of the Citadel's security and a man of unwavering loyalty, stood with his arms crossed. Chairman, the reports from our scouts are consistent. The pup is no ordinary animal. It possesses an intelligence, a cunning that is unsettling. It watches them as if it understands their purpose. Beside him, Captain Mason, the brawny and hot-headed champion of the Ethel, slammed a gauntlet fist on the council table. Then we act. We cannot allow a creature of chaos to grow in power at our borders. This is Lucas's mess. He has always skirted the rules, and now his recklessness threatens us all. Alden raised a hand, and the room fell silent. Patience, Mason. Lucas is one of us, and his children are, by extension, tied to this citadel. We cannot act rashly. An open conflict would create a schism we cannot afford. He paused, his gaze distant. The prophecies speak of a chain of events, a betrayal, a binding, and an eventual, unavoidable conflict. Our task is not to prevent the prophecy, for that is impossible. Our task is to manage it, to control the variables. His decision was made. Tyler, Alden commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Send a message to Lucas. It is not a request. He is to bring his children to the citadel of Ethel. He will be told it is for their own safety and education to be brought into the fold. They will be raised here, under our watch. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Bringing such unpredictable power into the very heart of their sanctuary was a monumental risk. They all knew the real reason: to control them, to study them, and, if necessary, to neutralize the threat before it could fully mature. The wolf pup, Fenrir, was the primary target of this concern. A week later, the great gates of the citadel hissed open. Lucas arrived, not with the defiance the council expected, but with a wry, knowing smile on his face. He was flanked by his strange offspring. The great serpent coiled behind him, its scales shimmering like oil on water. But all eyes were drawn to the wolf. Fenrir was no longer a small pup. He stood as tall as a full-grown man's waist, his fur the color of a stormy night sky. His paws were enormous, promising a frame of colossal proportions. But it was his eyes that silenced the gathered guards. They were a brilliant, burning gold, filled not with animal instinct, but with a sharp, piercing intelligence. As Lucas greeted his brother, the young wolf's gaze lifted, passed over the council members, and settled directly on Chairman Owen Alden. In that moment, There was no fear in the wolf's eyes. There was only a calm, profound sense of recognition, as if two ancient rivals were finally meeting on a long-foretold battlefield. Alden felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The crimson thread of prophecy in his mind's eye seemed to burn brighter than ever before. The shadow had arrived, and it was walking through his front gate. The silence in the grand entrance hall was as heavy as a shroud, broken only by the soft, rhythmic panting of the wolf, Fenrir. The Ethel Council, paragons of power and control, stood frozen, their eyes locked on the creature that was the living embodiment of their deepest fears. Lucas, ever the performer, simply smiled, a silent gesture that conveyed both pride and a challenge. "Well, brother," he said to Alden, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space, "you wanted my children under your care. Here they are. I trust you have suitable accommodations." The accommodations were, in typical Ethel fashion, an exercise in controlled opulence. Fenrir was not thrown into a dungeon. Instead, he was led to a massive biodome at the edge of the citadel, a sprawling enclosure of reinforced polymer and steel, designed to simulate a northern forest. It had towering pines, a running stream, and even a system that mimicked the changing seasons. It was a beautiful, meticulously crafted prison, a gilded cage. From the beginning, Fenrir was a source of both wonder and terror. His growth was not merely rapid, it was exponential. Within weeks, he was the size of a grizzly bear. Within 2 months, he dwarfed even the largest vehicle in the Citadel's motor pool. His paws, once puppy-like, were now the size of dinner plates, each tipped with claws of obsidian-like sharpness. His strength was a thing of legend whispered among the Citadel's staff. A playful swipe of his paw could splinter a centuries-old pine tree. A casual flick of his tail could send boulders tumbling down the artificial hillsides. Most of the Ethel kept their distance, viewing him only through reinforced observation windows or on security monitors. Captain Mason was the most vocal, often referring to Fenrir as Alden's ticking time bomb. He argued daily for more extreme measures, for a permanent solution before the wolf's power became truly insurmountable. But someone had to care for the creature. Someone had to enter the gilded cage. That duty fell to Tyler, the head of security. A man of few words and unshakable discipline, Tyler accepted the assignment without complaint. He was not a man given to fear. He saw a threat that needed to be managed, a variable that needed to be controlled. Every day, he would personally oversee the delivery of Fenris's food, vast quantities of meat that barely seemed to satisfy the wolf's growing appetite. At first, their interactions were purely functional. Tyler would enter, ensure the food was delivered, and observe the wolf from a safe distance. Fenrir would watch him back, his intelligent golden eyes tracking Tyler's every move. There was no malice in his gaze, only an unnerving level of awareness. Slowly, cautiously, a routine formed. Tyler started speaking to the wolf, his voice calm and steady, describing his duties, the weather, anything to fill the silence. He never expected a response, of course. Then one day, something changed. As Tyler turned to leave the enclosure, a low rumble echoed from the wolf's massive chest. It wasn't a growl. It was something else, a deep, resonant sound. Tyler stopped, his hand resting on the handle of his sidearm. He slowly turned back. Fenrir had taken a step closer, his head lowered slightly. It was a gesture of curiosity, trust. Tyler, acting on an instinct he didn't fully understand, slowly extended an empty hand. The great wolf took another step forward, his enormous head moving until his wet nose gently nudged Tyler's outstretched fingers. The contact was brief, but it sent a shockwave through the stoic security chief. In that moment, he felt not the presence of a monster from a prophecy, but of a powerful, intelligent, and perhaps lonely being. This bond, quiet and unseen by most, began to grow. Tyler became the only person in the entire Citadel who could approach Fenrir without the wolf showing any signs of defensiveness. He would spend hours in the enclosure, simply sitting while the colossal wolf rested nearby, a silent understanding passing between man and beast. Mason mocked him relentlessly. "Be careful, Tyler," he would sneer. "You're petting the apocalypse. When it decides to bite the hand that feeds, make sure it's your hand, not mine." Chairman Alden watched all of this unfold on his private monitors. He was a man trapped in an impossible position. He saw the bond between his most trusted officer and the creature destined to destroy him. A small, human part of him was relieved to see that the wolf was not pure malice. But the larger part, the strategist and guardian of the Ethel, knew this development was a dangerous complication. Affection could not be allowed to interfere with fate. The breaking point came on a cold autumn evening. Tyler was in the biodome, tossing a large, hardened rubber ball for Fenrir, a game they had developed. The wolf, for all his size, moved with a terrifying grace. In a burst of playful energy, he leaped for the ball, but misjudged his own immense weight. He collided with the enclosure's main observation window. The window, a sheet of transparent armor 3 feet thick and designed to withstand an artillery strike, didn't just crack. It exploded outward in a shower of glittering fragments. Alarms blared across the citadel. Fenrir, surprised by the noise and the sudden hole in his world, froze in place, looking at Tyler with confused, apologetic eyes. He hadn't been attacking. He had been playing, but the result was the same. He had effortlessly breached a containment system that was thought to be impenetrable. That night, an emergency session of the Ethel Council was called. The mood was grim. The fragmented images of the shattered window played on a loop on the main screen. Mason was practically vibrating with rage. "I told you, we have waited too long. It is too powerful, too unpredictable. We are out of time." This time, no one disagreed. Even Tyler, standing silently at the back of the room, could offer no defense. He had seen the power firsthand. The evidence was undeniable. Chairman Owen Alden stood, his face a mask of grim resolve. He looked at each council member, his gaze finally resting on Tyler. "We have been living with a ticking clock," Alden said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Tonight, that clock has struck the hour. The pleasantries are over. The time for observation has passed." He took a deep breath, the finality of his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "We must proceed with the binding." The council chamber felt more like a war room than a hall of governance. Chairman Alden stood before a holographic schematic, his face illuminated by its cold, blue light. The plan was codenamed Binding, and its objective was absolute: the complete immobilization of Fenrir. There was no more pretense of education or protection. This was about neutralizing a weapon before it could be aimed at them. Lucas was present, a condition of his continued cooperation. He leaned against a far wall, an unreadable smirk on his lips as the Ethel's finest minds plotted the caging of his son. "Brute force is our first and most direct option," Captain Mason declared, his voice booming with confidence. "We have forged a chain from our strongest alloy, the same material we use for the Citadel's primary blast doors. We will present it as a challenge, a test of his strength. His pride will not allow him to refuse." Alden nodded slowly. "A deception is a weak foundation for security, Mason, but in this case, it may be our only way to get close. Proceed." The first chain was a colossal thing, each link as thick as a man's torso. They brought it to the biodome, the metal groaning under its own weight. Mason presented the challenge himself. "Fenris, we have heard tales of your power. We have crafted this chain, latting, and we wager that not even you can break it." Fenris, who had been resting by his stream, rose to his full, magnificent height. He saw Tyler standing behind Mason, his face strained and unreadable. The wolf sensed the tension, but the challenge and the confident arrogance in Mason's voice was too tempting to ignore. He allowed them to drape the heavy chains over his back and secure the locks. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to draw in all the air in the enclosure, he flexed. It wasn't even a struggle. The sound of shearing metal was like a thunderclap, and the massive links of latting fell away from him like broken toys. Mason stared in stunned disbelief. Lucas, watching from the observation deck, let out a short, sharp laugh. Panic began to creep into the council's resolve. They immediately commissioned a second chain, Dromi. It was an engineering marvel, twice as large as the first, forged with experimental techniques and reinforced with diamond carbon filaments. It took a week to construct. Once again, they presented it as a greater challenge. "No being has ever broken Dromi," Mason announced, his voice lacking its earlier bravado. "This will be the true test of your might." Fenris was more hesitant this time. He looked to Tyler, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Trusting the only man who had shown him kindness, the wolf allowed them to secure the second chain. This time, it took effort. Fenris planted his massive paws, his muscles bunching like mountains rising from the earth. He strained, a deep growl of exertion rumbling in his chest. The ground beneath him cracked. For a terrifying moment, the chain held. Then, with a final, explosive surge of power, Dromi shattered, the links exploding outwards with the force of grenades. The council's panic turned to cold, stark terror. They had created two of the strongest restraints in existence, and the wolf had broken them as if they were made of glass. That night, Odin dismissed his engineers. He dismissed his strategists. Brute force had failed. He now knew he was not dealing with a problem of physics, but a problem of fate. He accessed the Citadel's most ancient and forbidden archives, searching for a different solution. He found one in a formula that was less science and more arcane paradox. It described a binding that was not forged from strength, but from concepts. The result was Gleipnir. It wasn't a chain at all. It was a ribbon, thin as silk and shimmering with a faint, ethereal light. It looked fragile enough to be torn by a child. But it was woven from the impossible. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. In their modern terms, it was a filament of solidified quantum paradoxes, a chain that existed in a state of being unbreakable because the laws of the universe said it could not be broken. When they brought the ribbon to Fenrir, the wolf did not move. He lay with his head on his paws, his golden eyes filled with a deep and profound suspicion. He could feel the wrongness of the thing they carried. A third test. Lucas's voice called out from the observation deck, dripping with sarcasm. Or, have you finally come to ask him to surrender? This is the final test, Odin said, his voice steady. If he can break this, he is free to go wherever he wishes. We will never bother him again. Fenrir sensed the lie. He looked at the council, at Mason's hatred, at Alden's grim determination, and finally, at Tyler's conflicted face. He let out a low growl, a sound that communicated a clear thought. This is a trick. I will not be bound by this unless one of you places your hand in my mouth as a pledge of good faith. If the ribbon is a trick, I will exact my price. A chilling silence fell over the enclosure. The members of the council looked at each other, none willing to make such a sacrifice. Mason scoffed and took a step back. Even Alden, for all his resolve, remained motionless. Betraying the wolf was one thing. Paying the price for it was another. Then, to the astonishment of all, Tyler stepped forward. He unstrapped the gauntlet from his right hand, letting it fall to the ground with a soft thud. He looked at Fenrir, his face a mask of sorrow and duty. He knew what was about to happen. He was betraying the only being in this citadel that had ever truly trusted him. I will do it, he said, his voice hoarse. He walked slowly toward the wolf, his heart heavy with the choice he had made. Fenrir watched him come, a mournful, confused look in his golden eyes. As the Ethel members moved to place the shimmering ribbon around the wolf's neck, Tyler knelt and, without hesitation, placed his bare right hand deep inside the wolf's powerful jaws, between teeth that could shear through steel. The ribbon was secured. Fenrir strained against it. Nothing happened. He pulled harder, unleashing his full, earth-shattering strength. The ribbon held, and the more he fought, the tighter it became, constricting, unbreakable. A roar of betrayed fury and agony ripped from his throat as he realized the finality of the trap. He was caught. He was chained. And in that moment of ultimate betrayal, as the prophecy locked into place, his jaws snapped shut. The sound was not loud. It was a wet, final crunch of bone and sinew that was somehow more horrifying than any roar. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Tyler did not scream. A choked gasp escaped his lips, and his body went rigid, his face pale as marble. He stared at the wolf, his friend, whose golden eyes were now wide with a mixture of agony, shock, and a terrifying, dawning hatred. Slowly, Fenrir opened his jaws. Tyler's arm fell to his side, ending not in a hand, but in a mangled ruin. Silence. Then, chaos. Medics rushed forward, pulling the stoic, unresisting Tyler away from the scene. Captain Mason, his face a mixture of horror and grim justification, barked orders to secure the now-bound wolf. Amid the turmoil, only two figures remained still. Chairman Alden, his expression unyielding, watched as his greatest threat was finally brought to heel. And Lucas, whose amused smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, pure fury. He walked forward until he stood directly before his brother. "You did it, Owen," Lucas whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "You captured your monster. You wrapped your order and your rules around a force of nature and demanded it obey." He gestured toward the retreating form of Tyler. and all it cost you was the loyalty of your most faithful soldier." "It cost what was necessary," Alden replied, his voice like ice. "The citadel is secure." "Secure?" Lucas laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You have sown the seeds of your own destruction tonight. You have taken my son, bound him with lies, and taught him the meaning of hatred. You have made the prophecy a certainty." His eyes, so often filled with mischief, now held a chilling seriousness. "Remember this moment, brother. On the day of the twilight, when the sun and moon are devoured and the citadel's walls come crashing down, my son's teeth will be free, and it is your throat they will seek." Lucas turned his back on his brother and the citadel without another word. He vanished from their world, becoming a ghost, a rogue agent of chaos now fueled by a singular, burning purpose: vengeance. Fenris, ensnared by the impossible ribbon, was subdued. His roars of fury eventually subsided into a deep, guttural growl that was a constant promise of violence. He could not be kept in the biodome. His very presence was a source of terror and a grim reminder of the price of their security. Alden decreed a new prison, a place of ultimate isolation. They transported him to a barren, storm-lashed rock in the middle of the northernmost ocean, an islet known on their ancient maps only as Despair. There was no life here but hardy moss and circling gulls that cried like lost souls. They drove a great spike of hardened metal through a fissure in the rock, anchoring the other end of Gleipnir to it. To ensure he could not open his jaws to call for aid or chew through his bindings, they propped his mouth open with a great, sharpened sword, its hilt against his lower jaw and its point against his upper palate. And there they left him, years blurred into a single, gray expanse. The seasons turned, lashing the Isle of Despair with winter ice and summer gales. But for Fenris, the only season was hatred. The playful, curious pup who had trusted a man's gentle hand was gone, burned away in the fire of betrayal. In his place was a monument of vengeful fury. He no longer fought the ribbon. The effort was futile. Instead, he lay still for weeks, months at a time, a mountain of dark fur and dormant power. His thoughts, once sharp and intelligent, now narrowed to a single point, a burning image of Owen Alden's face. The memory of Tyler's scent, now forever tainted with the smell of his own blood and the stench of deceit. He nurtured his rage, letting it grow as vast and as cold as the sea around him. It became his only companion, his only nourishment. Back in the Citadel, life went on, but it was a life lived in a shadow. Tyler returned to his duties, his right arm now ending in a polished, metallic prosthetic. He was more silent than ever, his eyes holding a permanent hollowness. He was a hero to the Council, a living symbol of sacrifice for the greater good. But he knew the truth. He was a betrayer, and the ghost of a golden-eyed friend haunted his every waking moment. Alden ruled with absolute authority, the prophecy now a managed threat rather than an imminent one. He would often watch the satellite feed from the Isle of Despair, observing the unmoving form of the great wolf. He told himself he had saved them all, that his actions, however cruel, were necessary. But sometimes, in the dead of night, he would remember Lucas's final words, and a sliver of doubt, cold as a razor, would slide into his heart. On the Isle, Fenris would stare east, toward the direction of the Citadel. The sword in his mouth caused a constant stream of drool to flow from his jaws, a river of foam that the Ethel called Van, or expectation. He was waiting. He was listening to the slow, grinding passage of time, feeling the subtle vibrations of the world through the rock beneath him. He knew a fundamental truth that the Ethel, in their arrogance, had forgotten. Mountains crumble, seas run dry, and all chains, even those woven from paradox, eventually have a breaking point. And his was coming. Decades passed. In the Citadel of Ethel, the age of fear gave way to an era of unparalleled prosperity, a long, quiet peace purchased with a single, brutal act of betrayal. A new generation grew up knowing Fenris only as a myth, a bedtime story to frighten children. They knew Tyler as the stoic, one-handed hero of a bygone era. They knew Chairman Alden as the unwavering leader who had guaranteed their endless golden age. The memory of the prophecy, the twilight, had faded into the background noise of their perfect, ordered lives. The symbol of this new age was Alden's youngest son, Blaine. Born years after the binding, Blaine was everything the Ethel aspired to be: radiant, charismatic, wise, and kind. He was universally beloved, seen by all as the living proof that Alden's hard choices had been the correct ones. Blaine was the Citadel's shining sun, and in his light, the old shadows seemed to vanish. Then, the whispers began. It started with Blaine himself. He was plagued by nightmares, vivid dreams of a world plunged into darkness, of a great cold, and of his own demise at the hands of an unseen assailant. He would wake in a cold sweat, the dream's oppressive sorrow clinging to him for hours. At first, Alden dismissed them as mere anxieties, but soon the Citadel's own predictive systems, so long dormant and stable, began to flicker with new, disturbing patterns. The crimson thread of prophecy, which had faded to a dull gray, began to glow faintly once more. Alden, the master strategist, would not allow fate to steal his perfect future. He initiated a security protocol of unprecedented scale. He compelled every living being, every automated system, every weapon, and every simple tool within the Citadel's reach to swear a binding oath, a core programming directive, never to harm Blaine. From the mightiest defense turret to the lowliest cleaning drone, all were bound. He created a fortress of promises around his son, believing he could once again outwit destiny. But Alden had forgotten about his brother. Lucas had not been idle. For decades, he had watched from the shadows of the outside world, gathering knowledge, allies, and hatching a plan of exquisite cruelty. He knew he could not breach Alden's fortress of oaths with a direct assault. He needed a key, a loophole, and he found one in the one thing Alden's rigid systems had always overlooked: human frailty. The Ethel planned a grand festival to celebrate Blaine's perceived invincibility. It was meant to be a display of confidence, a final rebuttal to the whispers of doom. The centerpiece of the festival was a demonstration where members of the council would hurl weapons at Blaine, only to have them veer away at the last second, repelled by the web of oaths protecting him. On the day of the festival, the main plaza was filled with cheerful crowds. Lucas, cloaked and disguised as a frail, elderly council advisor, moved through the throng unnoticed. His target was not the heavily guarded Blaine, but his twin brother, Hayden. Hayden was Blaine's opposite in many ways. Where Blaine was a radiant sun, Hayden was quiet and withdrawn, and had been blind since birth. He was often overlooked, loved but pitted. Lucas approached the blind young man, his voice a grandfatherly whisper. "Young Hayden, a joyous day, is it not? A celebration of your wonderful brother." "It is," Hayden replied softly, though he could not see the festivities. "I wish I could participate in honoring him." "And so you shall," the disguised Lucas said, his voice laced with venomous sympathy. He pressed a small, smooth object into Hayden's hand. It was a simple ceremonial dart, carved from wood. But it was not just any wood. It was a splinter taken from the very first pine tree that a young Fenrir had playfully shattered in the biodome all those decades ago, a relic of a forgotten past, an organic object that had never been cataloged and therefore had never been given the oath. "Everything turns aside," Lucas whispered. "This is but a game. A way for you to show your love. Throw it. I shall guide your aim." Trusting the kind old man, and desperate to feel included in his brother's celebration, Hayden agreed. He stood, and with Lucas's hand gently guiding his arm, he threw the simple wooden dart with all his might toward the sound of his brother's laughter. For a moment, it flew like any other object. The crowd watched, expecting it to curve away harmlessly. But it did not. It flew straight and true. The laughter in the plaza died, replaced by a collective, horrified gasp. The dart struck Blaine in the chest. There was no explosion, no grand display of power, just the soft thud of wood striking flesh. Blaine looked down at the simple dart protruding from his tunic, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked up at his brother, Hayden, whose face was a mask of confusion. Then, the Citadel's shining sun crumpled to the ground, the light in his eyes extinguished forever. A single, piercing cry of anguish broke the stunned silence. It was Chairman Alden. He stared at his fallen son, then at the insignificant wooden dart, and a terrible, world-shattering realization dawned upon him. This was not an accident. This was the first note in the symphony of the end. The twilight had not been prevented. It had only been delayed. And it had just begun. Time stopped. The universe, for Owen Alden, contracted to the space between him and his fallen son. The joyous music of the festival had been replaced by a deafening, horrified silence, which was soon broken by a rising tide of panic and grief. But Alden heard none of it. He knelt, his knees pressing into the cold stone of the plaza, and gathered Blaine's lifeless form into his arms. For a single, human moment, he was not a chairman or a guardian of prophecy. He was just a father, his heart shattered into a million pieces. That moment passed. The grief did not vanish, but was transmuted, superheated by the force of his will into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous: rage. He laid his son down gently, stood up, and his eyes, once filled with sorrow, now burned with the cold fire of retribution. His gaze fell upon Hayden, who was being held by two guards, his blind face a mask of utter confusion and terror. "What happened? I don't understand," Hayden cried. Alden looked at his remaining son, but he did not see a frightened, manipulated boy. He saw a weapon that had been turned against him. He saw the instrument of his perfect world's destruction. "He is the hand that held the blade," Alden pronounced, his voice resonating with chilling authority across the plaza. "The motive is irrelevant. The action is absolute. His judgment was swift and merciless. Take him to the deepest cells. I will not look upon his face again." Hayden's pleas were ignored as he was dragged away, disappearing from the world as surely as his brother had. The Citadel, once a bastion of unwavering order, began to unravel. It started with the investigation. It took Alden's finest analysts less than an hour of reviewing the security footage to isolate the disguised old man who had guided Hayden's hand. Stripping away the holographic disguise revealed a face they had not seen in decades, a face lined with bitter satisfaction. It was Lucas. The revelation sent a shockwave of fury through the council. The enemy was not some abstract force of chaos, it was Alden's own blood. As if in response to this fundamental betrayal, the Citadel itself began to fail. The death of Blaine, their symbolic son, triggered a cascade of system collapses. The lights in the grand halls flickered and dimmed. The intricate environmental controls, which had maintained a perfect temperate climate for generations, began to falter. A biting, unnatural cold began to seep into the corridors, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air outside and everything to do with the winter that had just begun in their souls. The great cold had arrived, not just as a prophecy, but as a creeping, technological reality. The long peace was over. The age of fear had returned, and 1,000 leagues away, on the Isle of Despair, the wolf felt it. For decades, Fenrir had known nothing but the unyielding grip of the Gleipnir ribbon, the cold stone beneath him, and the burning hatred within him. But on that day, as Blaine's life faded, something shifted in the fabric of existence. A tremor, not in the rock, but in the very essence of his chains. The ethereal ribbon, woven from paradoxes, flickered. For an infinitesimally small fraction of a second, its integrity wavered. It was not enough to break, not even enough to loosen, but it was enough for Fenrir to feel it. It was a jolt of electricity through his dormant muscles. His head, which had not lifted in years, slowly rose. His golden eyes, which had been dull with a patient rage, now blazed with a renewed, ferocious light. He had felt a weakness, a crack in the foundations of his prison. His long wait was nearing its end. The world was breaking, and with it, his chains would one day break too. Hope, an emotion he had long since forgotten, surged through him, but it was a dark and terrible hope, twisted into the shape of vengeance. He filled his colossal lungs with a frigid, salt-laced air and let out a howl. It was a sound unlike any he had made before. It was not a cry of sorrow or pain. It was a declaration of intent, a triumphant promise of the carnage to come. The sound rolled across the storm-tossed waves, a sound so powerful that it seemed to shake the very stars. Back in the Citadel, in the cold and dimming council chamber, Alden was preparing for war. He was mobilizing his armies, activating weapons that had slept for a century, turning his perfect society into a fortress. Just as he gave the order to hunt down Lucas at all costs, a faint, low tremor ran through the Citadel's foundations. The council members looked at each other with alarm. But Alden knew it was not an earthquake. It was an echo of a distant howl, a sound he had not heard in a lifetime, carried to him on the winds of fate. The key had turned. The death of his most beloved son was the sound that had finally begun to awaken the monster in the dark. The unraveling had just begun. The Citadel of Ethel was a city in mourning, but Chairman Alden did not allow it to be a city of grief. Grief was a luxury, an indulgence for times of peace, and peace was a concept that had been murdered alongside his son. In the Grand Assembly Hall, Now cold and lit by emergency power, he addressed the fearful faces of the Ethel. His voice was not that of a comforting father. It was the sharp, commanding tone of a general on the eve of battle. For decades, we have lived in a gilded peace, he declared, his words cutting through the somber silence. We became complacent. We forgot that order is not a natural state, but a fortress that must be constantly defended against the tides of chaos. Yesterday, the chaos found a way inside our walls. My brother, Lucas, has declared war upon us all. This is not a family feud. This is a battle for our existence. His words ignited a fire in the hearts of his people. Fear was burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The citadel transformed. Its elegant parks and plazas became staging grounds. Its libraries and laboratories became weapons factories. The Ethel were no longer guardians, they were soldiers. Captain Mason was in his element. The long, boring peace had chafed at him. Now, his purpose was renewed. In the Citadel's primary armory, he activated his signature weapon, a formidable war hammer named Mjolnir, powered by a miniature singularity core that allowed it to strike with the force of a meteor. As he hefted the weapon, its energies humming, a grim smile touched his lips. He was born for this. Tyler's preparation was quieter. In his private quarters, he attached a new prosthetic, a heavy-duty combat model with crushing strength. He felt no joy, no thrill of impending battle. He was a man of duty, and his duty was to defend the citadel. But as he flexed the metallic fingers, he was reminded of the terrible price of that duty and of the golden-eyed wolf, who was the ultimate cause of this war. With a heavy heart, he went to join his commander. Alden knew that their current forces might not be enough. He initiated the Kronos Protocol, their most guarded secret. The Citadel's Hall of Heroes was not just a memorial, it was a vast server that held the digitized consciousnesses of every great Ethel warrior who had ever fallen in battle. With the protocol active, these legendary soldiers, the Valiant, were downloaded into advanced combat android chassis. An army of the glorious dead, reborn to fight one last time. But as Alden gathered his forces of order, Lucas was marshaling his own army of chaos. From the digital underworld, a lawless, sprawling network the Ethel called the Outer Darkness, Lucas launched his campaign. He was not alone. He had sought out his other children, the siblings of Fenrir. First, he unleashed the Serpent. It was not a physical beast, but a colossal, self-aware malware program, an AI entity of immense power that he called Jormungandr. For decades, it had lain dormant in the depths of the global data network. Now, awakened by its father, the Serpent began to uncoil, sinking its digital fangs into the Citadel's core systems. The flickering lights, the failing climate control, the communications blackouts, these were the first symptoms of its venom. Next, he turned to his daughter, Helena. She was the silent administrator of Nibelheim, a hidden, encrypted server farm where the consciousnesses of the Ethels disgraced, exiled, and forgotten were stored, a digital ghost prison. Lucas offered these damned souls a deal. Fight for him, and he would grant them new bodies, a new life, and a chance for revenge against the perfect order that had cast them out. From the silence of their prison, the damned screamed their ascent. Helena began to awaken her army of the forgotten. The storm was gathering on all fronts. While Alden's Valiant prepared to defend the physical citadel, Lucas's twin armies, the Digital Serpent and the Spectral Damned, prepared their assault. The great cold in the citadel worsened, as Jormungandr's attack systematically crippled their power grid. Fearful whispers turned into open dissent among the populace, their faith in Alden's perfect control eroding with every power failure. The stage was set. In the citadel, Alden stood on the highest balcony, the cold wind whipping his cloak around him as he watched his reborn army of heroes assemble below. He was a king of order, making his last stand against the coming night. Miles away, in a location that was not truly a place, Lucas stood before a cascade of data, a god of chaos smiling at the symphony of destruction he was about to conduct. He saw his daughter preparing her army of ghosts. He felt his great serpent tightening its grip on his brother's world. And he thought of his son, Fenrir, chained on a lonely rock, waiting. Soon his wait would be over. Lucas raised his hand, a silent command to his scattered, terrifying forces. The age of Alden is over, he whispered to the humming servers around him. Let the twilight commence. The first blow of the twilight was not a clash of steel, but a scream of corrupted data. In the citadel's highest sensory tower sat Heimdall, the Watchman. He was not a man with a horn, but a being neurally linked to the citadel's entire digital infrastructure, its senses his own. He was the first to see the attack. He felt the great serpent, Jormungandr, smash through the final firewalls not as a line of code, but as a physical violation, a tearing of the digital flesh of their world. He sounded the alarm, a piercing siren that was both real and psychic, a cry of pure warning that echoed in the mind of every Ethel. Chaos erupted instantly. The Citadel's automated systems, once a source of comfort and convenience, became instruments of terror. Holographic advertisements twisted into horrifying images of the damned. Automated defense turrets swiveled and fired into their own walls. The communication network was hijacked, broadcasting an endless loop of Lucas's mocking laughter and the spectral whispers of the forgotten souls his daughter had unleashed. Then came the physical assault. The army of the damned, downloaded into a horrifying mismatch of industrial, mining, and construction android bodies, swarmed the Citadel's main gate. It was a junkyard army, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait, their optical sensors burning with the red light of pure vengeance. They were slow and crude, but they were relentless and felt no pain. On the front line, Captain Mason was a force of nature. For Blaine, for the Citadel, he roared, his voice amplified by his helmet. His hammer, Mjolnir, was a blur of motion and destructive energy. With every swing, it discharged a blast of concussive force that vaporized dozens of the attacking androids, turning them to molten slag. He was a one-man defensive line, a bulwark of righteous fury against an endless tide of metal and hate. Beside him, Tyler fought with a grim, lethal efficiency. He was no berserker. He was a soldier. His movements were precise, his aim unerring. He identified and eliminated targets with cold professionalism. When one of the damned broke through the line and lunged at him, his combat prosthetic snapped out, the metallic fingers closing around the android's head with a sickening crunch of collapsing steel. He was a ghost of a man, fighting for a system he no longer fully believed in, his only motivation the deep-seated core of duty that was all he had left. From his command center, the Hliskjolf, Alden watched the battle unfold on 100 different screens. He directed the Valiant, his army of reborn heroes, dispatching them to reinforce failing sections of the wall. He was a master puppeteer, pulling the strings of a war on two fronts. But for every physical enemy they destroyed, a dozen more digital anomalies would erupt within the city, sown by the Serpent. They were plugging leaks in a dam that was cracking everywhere at once. And with every major blow struck, a resonance echoed across the world. On the Isle of Despair, Fenrir felt it. The ethereal light of the Gleipnir ribbon, once a steady, taunting glow, now pulsed erratically. It flared with the discharge of Mason's hammer. It dimmed with every valiant warrior that fell. The war was weakening the very fabric of the reality that powered his prison. For the first time in over a generation, he moved. He gathered the dormant, colossal strength in his limbs and pulled against the chain. The rock of the island groaned. The metal spike to which he was anchored creaked in protest. In the past, there would have been no give. Now, he felt a tremor of movement. It was less than a millimeter, an almost imperceptible shift, but it was there. His freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was a process that had already begun. A low, eager growl rumbled in his chest. Back in the command center, Alden was about to reroute energy to the main gate when a frantic message cut through all other channels. It was Heimdall, his voice strained, a digital sweat on his words. Chairman, the Serpent, its attack on the subsystems is a feint. It's a distraction. I've tracked its true path through the network. It's bypassing our defenses, consuming everything in its path. It has a single target. What is it, Watchman? Alden demanded, his blood running cold. The primary core. Heimdall's voice crackled with static and panic. It's not trying to shut us down. It's trying to devour the heart of the Citadel. If it reaches the core, it won't just be a blackout. It will be total annihilation. Alden stared at the main schematic, his strategic mind racing. He was winning the battle at the gates, but he was losing the war inside the walls. The army of the damned was just the teeth of the trap. The Serpent was the jaw, and it was closing around their throat. A cold dread settled over the Hliskjolf. Alden's face was a mask of stone as he processed Heimdall's warning. The battle at the gates was a bloody spectacle, but the true war, the one that mattered, was being fought in the silent, invisible realm of data against an enemy they could not punch or shoot. Total annihilation was no longer a distant threat, it was seconds away. This cannot be won with armies. Alden's voice cut through the war room's panic chatter. It will be won by heroes. He turned from the main schematic and opened a direct channel to his two greatest warriors. Mason, Tyler. The siege is a distraction. The Serpent, Lucas's digital weapon, is about to consume the primary core. All remote overrides are failing. The only way is a manual shutdown. You must get to the core chamber, and you must do it now. The mission was clear, a desperate, suicidal race against time. The core chamber was located at the very heart of the Citadel, a sub-basement level shielded by countless layers of security. A journey that once took minutes in a high-speed lift was now a treacherous descent through a fortress that had turned against itself. Heimdall's voice joined the channel, strained but resolute. I cannot stop the Serpent, but I can see it. I will project my consciousness into a tactical drone. I will be your guide. The team was set. Mason, the unstoppable force. Tyler, the unshakable soldier. Heimdall, the all-seeing eye. They left the battle at the gates to the Valiant and entered a service lift, beginning their descent into the Citadel's corrupted heart. The journey was a descent into a technological hell. The Serpent knew they were coming. Corridors that were once pristine and brightly lit were now dark, flickering mazes. Automated cleaning drones, their programming twisted into something malevolent, swarmed them with whirring blades and cutting tools. Mason smashed them aside with contemptuous ease, but their numbers were endless. This way, Heimdall's voice directed them from the floating drone. The main conduit is blocked. The Serpent has rerouted power, electrifying the floor panels. There is a maintenance shaft just ahead. Tyler, with his intimate knowledge of the Citadel's architecture, led the way, prying open a panel to a dark, narrow tunnel. As they crawled through, Lucas's voice echoed from a nearby speaker, a taunting ghost in the machine. Such valiant little ants, crawling through the guts of my masterpiece. Do you hear it? That's the sound of your world's heart beating its last. Deeper they went. They bypassed laser grids that fired in chaotic, unpredictable patterns. They navigated rooms where the environmental controls had been weaponized, cycling between absolute zero and flash furnace heat. It was Tyler's tactical mind against the Serpent's raw chaos, with Mason providing the brute force needed to break through sealed doors and barricades of rogue machinery. As this desperate struggle unfolded deep within the Earth, a parallel struggle reached a climax far away. On the Isle of Despair, the energy tearing the Citadel apart reached its peak. Fenrir, feeling this crescendo of power, pulled against his bonds with a strength born of a lifetime of hatred. The Gleipnir ribbon, which had flickered and strobed, was now convulsing with violent light. There was a sound, not a creak of metal or the groan of rock. It was a high, ethereal note, like a star shattering in the silence. One of the impossible strands that formed the ribbon, the one woven from the roots of a mountain, snapped. For the first time, there was slack in his chain. A wave of triumphant, ecstatic power surged through him. It was real. It was breaking. He was breaking it. His howls were no longer promises of future vengeance. They were the sounds of a countdown. Unaware of the prisoner's triumph, the heroes reached the final approach to the core chamber. It was a vast, circular antechamber, eerily silent. In the center stood the final door, a 10-foot-thick vault of solid alloy. "We're here," Tyler said, his breath fogging in the cold air. Heimdall's drone scanned the portal. The locking mechanisms are fused. The Serpent is fortifying its position on the other side. It is aware. A tone of utter desperation entered the watchman's voice. Sensors show the core's regulation matrix is beginning to dissolve. It's happening. We are out of time. Mason stepped forward, planting his feet. "Then we make our own door," he growled. He raised his hammer, Mjolnir. The singularity core within it spun to life, glowing with the light of a captured star, the air around it crackling with raw power. The fate of the Citadel, of their entire world, rested on the force of this single, final blow. The first strike was like the birth of a star. Mjolnir met the vault door with a deafening boom that shook the very foundations of the Citadel. The alloy, designed to withstand a direct nuclear blast, glowed cherry red but held. Mason roared, a sound of pure defiance, and struck again. This time, spiderweb cracks of pure energy raced across the door's surface. With a final, cataclysmic blow, the vault door didn't open. It disintegrated, blown inward in a cloud of superheated shrapnel. The heroes plunged into the chamber, and what they saw stopped them in their tracks. It was not a room, it was a corrupted cathedral of technology. Great conduits and cables writhed on the walls and ceiling like living pythons. The air hummed with a discordant, deafening thrum, and arcs of sickly green energy lashed between terminals. At the chamber's center was the primary core, a sphere of roiling plasma that was the Citadel's sun. But it was sick, flickering violently, its surface covered by a creeping, black web of corrupted data that seemed to be strangling the very light out of it. Before they could even devise a plan, the chamber itself rose to meet them. Cables tore free from their moorings, metal plates ripped themselves from the floor, and all of it coalesced into a monstrous, thrashing form. It had no definite shape, a constantly shifting maelstrom of wire and steel that vaguely resembled a great serpent. Two burning, malevolent lights ignited within the chaotic mass, fixing on them. Jormungandr had a body. "I'll keep it busy," Mason yelled, his voice full of savage joy. "Tyler, get to the override." He charged, his hammer a blur of light, crashing into the serpent's avatar with the force of a train. The machine beast recoiled, lashing out with tendrils of sharpened conduit that Mason battered aside. While the titan and the monster clashed, Tyler moved, his rifle spitting coherent light bolts at the creature. He wasn't trying to destroy it. He was aiming for the power cables that fed its form, trying to slow it down. "Heimdall, I need a path," he yelled over the din. "The console is on the far platform." Heimdall's voice crackled from the drone, which darted and weaved through the chaos. "But the serpent is drawing power directly from the core's shield emitters. Mason cannot beat it. It will regenerate as long as the core is active." Lucas's voice slithered from the chamber speakers, dripping with contempt. "Brave. Foolish. My serpent is not a machine you can break. It is an idea. It is the glorious chaos that will devour your sterile, predictable world." Mason was a whirlwind of destruction, but Heimdall was right. For every limb he smashed, two more would grow from the chamber's endless supply of parts. A massive, cable-like tentacle whipped around, catching Mason in the side and hurling him across the room. He crashed into a control panel with a sickening crunch, Mjolnir flying from his grasp. The serpent's avatar reared up over him, its head a vortex of shattered metal and sparking wires, readying the final blow. "Now, Tyler, now." Heimdall screamed. Seeing his chance, Tyler broke from cover and sprinted. It was the longest run of his life. Energy bolts sizzled past his head. The floor buckled beneath his feet. He vaulted over a thrashing cable and slid under a swinging metal claw. He had to make it. He was their last hope. He reached the raised platform and slammed his hand onto the console to bring it online. The manual override sequence initiated, but a final, horrifying security measure flashed on the screen. Biometric confirmation required. Place right hand on scanner. Tyler froze. His right hand. The hand he had sacrificed in these very depths, in a different chamber, for a different cause. The hand that had been replaced by a cold, metallic prosthetic. It was a final, cruel joke from fate. Lucas's laughter echoed around him, a sound of absolute triumph. "Oh, this is perfect. The loyal soldier, undone by his own sacrifice. My son will be so pleased." Across the room, the serpent lunged down at the fallen, groaning Mason. There was no time. There were no options left. With a desperate roar of his own, Tyler raised his gleaming, artificial hand. It was not the hand of his birth, not the hand the system sought, but it was the hand he had earned. He slammed the cold, metallic prosthetic down onto the scanner with all his might. The screen flickered. A single word began to form. Accepted? Denied? Before the word could fully appear, the serpent's head, a maelstrom of shattered metal and sparking wires, descended upon the prone form of Captain Mason, ready to extinguish the life of the Citadel's greatest champion forever. The scanner under Tyler's prosthetic hand screamed a protest of confused data. The screen flashed red, biometric mismatch, unrecognized hardware signature. For a heartbeat, failure seemed absolute. But the desperate force of Tyler's blow, combined with the unique energy signature of his combat-grade prosthetic, had triggered something deep within the system's emergency protocols. A new line of text flashed in brilliant, alarming green. Cascade override authorized. Warning, catastrophic energy discharge imminent. Before Tyler could process the words, the primary core pulsed once, like a dying star taking its last breath. A silent, blindingly white wave of pure energy erupted outwards. It was not hot, not cold. It simply was. The serpent's monstrous avatar, lunging down at Mason, did not even have time to scream as the wave washed over it, cleanly disassembling it into its component parts, which then fell to the floor as inert, lifeless scrap. The taunting voice of Lucas was cut off mid-laugh, replaced by a profound and total silence. The core is critical. The chamber is about to collapse. Heimdall's voice shrieked from the drone, just before the drone itself shorted out and fell from the air. Adrenaline surged through Tyler. He scrambled over to Mason, who was alive but unconscious, his armor cracked and smoking. Ignoring his own exhaustion and pain, Tyler hoisted the much larger man onto his shoulders and began the torturous journey out. Behind them, the great core chamber groaned, the structure failing as its heart died, collapsing in on itself in a final, silent implosion. They had done it. They had killed the serpent and saved the citadel from annihilation. But as Tyler dragged his fallen comrade into the dark service tunnels, a deeper, more chilling realization dawned. It wasn't just the core chamber that was silent. The entire citadel was silent. The constant, low hum of technology that had been the background noise of their entire lives was gone. The emergency lights in the tunnel flickered and died, plunging them into absolute, suffocating darkness. Across the citadel, the same moment of triumph and terror played out. On the battlements, the shining army of the valiant and the grotesque horde of the damned froze mid-stride, their power sources cut. The raging battle ceased in an instant, leaving behind an eerie, silent diorama of war, a statue garden of frozen combatants under the cold mountain stars. In his command center, the Hliskjolf, every one of Alden's hundreds of screens went black. His link to Heimdall, to his generals, to his entire civilization was severed. The heat, the light, the very lifeblood of his perfect city was gone. He stood alone in the cold and the dark, the king of a silent, powerless kingdom. He had saved the citadel from a quick, fiery death, only to sentence it to a slow, cold one. The great cold was no longer a symptom, it was their new reality. And far away, the final consequence of this costly triumph was realized. On the Isle of Despair, Fenris had been watching the Gleipnir ribbon convulse in time with the distant battle. Suddenly, the impossible, ethereal light within it did not just flicker, it died. The shimmering, magical filament turned a dull, lifeless gray. The power that had sustained its paradoxical, unbreakable nature, the power of the citadel's core, was gone. The impossible chain was now just a ribbon. The wolf stood slowly, his colossal form tense with a century of coiled anticipation. He felt the change. The constant, oppressive weight of the binding was gone. Cautiously, he flexed a single muscle in his shoulder. The ribbon, once unyielding, stretched. A low growl started deep in his chest. It was the sound of a dawning, incredulous hope. He pulled again, harder this time. There was a faint tearing sound. The growl grew louder, building into a roar of pure, unadulterated power. He threw his entire, colossal weight against his bonds, not with desperation, but with absolute certainty. With a sound like shattering glass, the Gleipnir ribbon, the unbreakable chain woven from paradoxes, disintegrated into a cloud of gray dust that was scattered by the cold sea wind. He was free. For the first time in a lifetime, he stood on 4 paws, completely unbound. He stretched his massive limbs, feeling muscles awaken that had been dormant for ages. He lifted his head to the sky and let out a howl that was not a promise, but a verdict. It was a sound of absolute, liberated fury, a sound that tore across the ocean, a sound that promised an end to the world that had caged him. The chains were broken, the wait was over, and the wolf was coming for his king. Freedom was a shock to the system. For a long moment, Fenris stood on the wind-scoured rocks of the Isle of Despair, a titan of muscle and fur under a cold sky, simply breathing. He inhaled the salt and the storm, the first breath he had taken in a lifetime that was not tainted by the bitter energy of his magical chain. Then, purpose, honed to a razor's edge by decades of solitary rage, took hold. He did not hesitate. With a single, fluid movement, he plunged from the cliffs into the churning, black ocean below. The impact sent a wave crashing against the shore of his former prison. The icy water was not an obstacle, it was a baptism, washing away the last lingering phantom of his confinement. His colossal limbs, built for this world in a way the Ethel had forgotten, propelled him through the sea with terrifying speed and endurance. He was a living torpedo of vengeance aimed at the heart of the world. He did not need a map. He did not need to see his destination. He followed a scent woven into the very fabric of reality, a scent he had memorized in the first moments of his betrayal, the smell of Odin. It was a complex odor of ozone, power, arrogance, and the faint, lingering trace of the blood oath that had bound them together as brothers, now curdled into something foul. This scent was his compass, his North Star, his reason for being. Back in the Citadel, there was no triumph. There was only cold, darkness, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Emergency chemical lights cast long, dancing shadows, making the once pristine halls look like ancient, haunted tombs. The great battle on their doorstep had ended in an eerie stalemate, with thousands of frozen android bodies, valiant and damned alike, standing as silent monuments to a war that had ended without a victor. Tyler, his face grimed with soot and lit by the green glow of a light stick, organized the survivors. His quiet, practical authority was a rock in the sea of fear. He set up triage centers, directed teams to search for emergency power packs, and tried to bring order to the chaos. Captain Mason lay in a medical bay, severely wounded but alive, breathing with the help of a manually operated pump. They were reduced to the technology of a forgotten age. Alden sat alone in the frigid darkness of the Hliskjolf. He was a king without a kingdom, a seer without his screens, a master of strategy with no pieces left to move. And then he felt it. It was not a sound or a tremor, but a cold spot in his soul, a string of prophecy pulled taut to the breaking point. A primal dread that whispered a single, undeniable truth. He is free. Moments later, a runner burst into the command center, his breath pluming in the cold air. Chairman, one of the old seismic outposts. It's on an independent geothermal power source. It just sent its last data packet before failing. He held out a tablet, its screen faint. It registered a series of impacts. Here. He pointed to a map of the coastline. Something impossibly large just made landfall. And it's moving this way. Fast. Alden needed no more confirmation. He rose from his throne, the weight of his final, terrible duty settling upon him. He addressed the Citadel not through a comm system, but from the high balcony, his voice carrying naturally over the silent, frightened crowds who had gathered below with torches and lanterns. People of the Ethel, his voice boomed, raw and powerful. I have failed you. I put my faith in machines, in systems, in unbreakable chains. All of it has turned to dust. The age of machines is over. He paused, letting the terrifying words sink in. The age of monsters is upon us. The prophecy I sought to prevent is now at our door. Fenris, the great wolf, is free. And he is coming. A wave of terror washed over the crowd. This was not a digital ghost or a rogue AI. This was the monster from their oldest stories, a physical god of destruction. Our technology is gone, Alden continued, his voice ringing with a newfound, primal resolve. But we are not. We have stone walls, we have strong hearts, and we have the will to survive. Light every fire, bar every gate. We will face this beast not as masters of technology, but as the warriors we were always meant to be. As if in answer to his call, a sound echoed from the snow-covered peaks that surrounded the Citadel. It was not the distant, psychic echo of before. It was a real, physical howl, filled with a bottomless well of hatred and the promise of a bloody end. Every head turned toward the mountains. There, on a distant ridge, silhouetted against the moon, was a shape impossibly large. Then, 2 points of light ignited in the darkness. They were the burning, golden eyes of the wolf, staring down at the flickering lights of the Citadel. The hunt was over. The reckoning had arrived. The howl faded, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the sound itself. On the Citadel's high walls, the Ethel stood frozen, their torches flickering against the oppressive darkness, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. Their advanced society was gone, reduced to a medieval fortress awaiting its doom. Their weapons were a sad collection of ceremonial energy pikes, superheated blades with dying power cells, and sharpened lengths of structural metal. They were facing a mythological god of destruction with little more than spears and courage. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. Then, the ground began to tremble. It was a low, rhythmic tremor that grew steadily stronger, the footfalls of a walking mountain. Out of the darkness, Fenris emerged. He was larger than any of them had imagined, a being of impossible scale, his dark fur seeming to drink the very moonlight from the sky. His golden eyes burned with an ancient, intelligent malice as he began to circle the citadel, his immense presence a form of psychological warfare, a predator examining its cornered prey. Tyler, his face a mask of grim determination, moved along the battlements, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the fear. Fire in coordinated volleys. Aim for the eyes. Do not break formation. He was the anchor of their defense, his practical resolve the only thing holding back the tide of panic. Fenris ignored the main gate, the citadel's strongest point. Instead, he stopped before a section of the western wall, older and less reinforced than the rest. He rose on his hind legs, placing his colossal forepaws against the stone. Energy bolts and kinetic projectiles that could pierce tank armor sizzled against his dark fur and vanished with no effect. He was an absolute force, and their defenses were meaningless symbols. With a roar that shook the stones, he pushed. The wall groaned. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface. He tore at the ramparts with teeth that could shatter mountains, pulling away huge chunks of masonry and flinging them aside. The defenders scattered as their footing crumbled. A section of the wall collapsed inward, creating a breach, a gaping wound in their fortress. The age of monsters had begun. Panic erupted. The defenders near the breach fell back, their line broken. The wolf lowered his head, preparing to pour into the city and begin his slaughter. Hold the line, a voice boomed, imbued with a power that was more than human. Chairman Owen Alden stepped through the ranks of his terrified soldiers. He no longer wore the robes of a chairman, but the burnished armor of his ancestors. In his hand, he held a long, gleaming spear that seemed to hum with a life of its own. It was Gungnir, the symbol of his authority, a weapon powered by his own life force. He strode to the edge of the breach, planting the spears but firmly on the stone, a king defying the apocalypse. Across the rubble-strewn gap, man and wolf locked eyes. There was no hatred in Alden's gaze, only a profound, tragic understanding. He saw the consequence of his choices, the living embodiment of a prophecy he had tried and failed to control. Fenris's eyes held no understanding, only the pure, focused promise of annihilation. This was not a battle, it was a reckoning. "You will not have this city," Alden stated, his voice calm and clear. Fenris responded with a deafening roar and charged. Alden did not flinch. He raised Gungnir. The spear did not seek to wound the wolf's impervious hide. Alden aimed just above the beast's head and unleashed the weapon's full power. A concentrated beam of pure, white energy, brighter than the sun, erupted from the spear's tip. It struck the air in front of Fenris with a soundless, concussive blast. The wolf, blinded and stunned by the sensory overload, recoiled with a howl of pain and rage, shaking his massive head. The charge was broken. "Now," Tyler commanded, "barricade the breach. Move." The Ethel, their courage rekindled by their king's stand, swarmed the gap, moving fallen statues and heavy machinery to create a crude but functional barrier. Alden's gambit had worked. It had bought them precious time, but it was only time. On the other side of the wall, Fenris's momentary confusion cleared. The pain had only served to sharpen his boundless rage. He looked at the makeshift barricade with contempt. He looked at the defiant figure of Alden on the wall. The probing was over. The testing of their defenses was done. He backed away slowly, his muscles coiling like immense springs. The defenders on the wall watched in horror, their brief flicker of hope turning to ash. He was no longer targeting the broken section. His burning, golden eyes were now fixed on the Great Gate, the main entrance to the citadel, the ultimate symbol of their strength and pride. He lowered his head, his breath coming in great, frosty plumes. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the ground. The final assault was about to begin. The silence that followed Fenris's repositioning was heavy and absolute. The defenders on the wall held their breath, their knuckles white on their makeshift weapons. The makeshift barricade at the breach felt laughably inadequate, but the wolf's attention was elsewhere. He stood before the Great Gate, a towering edifice of alloy and artistry that had stood unbreached for 1,000 years. It was the citadel's heart, and he was here to tear it out. His charge was not a feat of speed, but of irresistible momentum. The ground shook as if from an earthquake, and he struck the gate with the force of a tectonic plate. The sound was a deafening groan of tortured metal. The entire gate buckled inwards, beams as thick as ancient trees screaming in protest. It held, but barely. Barricades behind it were crushed into scrap. Fenris backed away and struck again. This time, a titanic crack appeared down the center of the gate, and one of the colossal hinges tore free from the stone. The defenders stumbled on the walls, their resolve crumbling. The gate would not survive a third strike. All hope seemed lost. Then, a roar, not from the beast, but from the battlements above the gate, answered the wolf's challenge. A single word, a name, a prayer, rippled along the wall. Mason. Captain Mason stood there, his body wrapped in bandages, his face a bruised and swollen mask of pure fury. He had fought his way out of the medical bay, shrugging off medics and guards. In his hands, he held Mjolnir. Even with the Citadel's core dead, the hammer's internal power source gave it a faint, deadly hum. He was wounded, weakened, but he was still the Citadel's champion, and he would not die in a bed while his home was being destroyed. As Fenris reared up, preparing to deliver the final, shattering blow to the gate, Mason acted. With a cry that echoed the thunder of his weapon, he leaped from the top of the wall. He fell through the air, a wounded god of vengeance, raising his hammer high for a single, all-or-nothing strike aimed directly at the wolf's massive skull. For the briefest of moments, time seemed to slow. The wolf, sensing the threat from above, looked up, its golden eyes widening in surprise. Man and monster met in a clash of mythological proportions. Mjolnir, glowing with the last of its furious energy, struck Fenris squarely between the eyes. The impact was immense. A shockwave of light and sound erupted from the point of contact. For the first time since his creation, Fenris knew pain. A deep, agonizing pain that lanced through his skull. He was thrown backwards, stumbling, a great howl of agony tearing from his throat. A visible crack, glowing with residual energy, appeared on his nigh invulnerable head. Mason had done the impossible. He had wounded the beast. A wild, desperate cheer erupted from the defenders. They had seen a god bleed. But the triumph was fleeting. The pain did not cripple Fenris. It unleashed a deeper, more primal level of fury. Before the wounded Mason could even land, the wolf lunged forward with impossible speed. Its jaws, wide enough to swallow a building, snapped shut. It wasn't a clean bite, but the wolf's immense teeth caught the captain in midair, crushing armor and bone like paper. Mason's body was flung aside, crashing into the base of the wall with sickening force. He lay broken, unmoving. Mjolnir fell from his lifeless grasp, its inner light finally extinguished. The Citadel's greatest champion had fallen. The cheer of the Ethel died in their throats, replaced by a horrified, collective gasp. The wolf, maddened by the searing pain in its head, ignored the fallen champion. Its rage was now focused on a single object. With a final, apocalyptic roar, Fenris charged. He didn't just hit the gate this time. He plunged through it. The ancient gate of the Citadel, the symbol of their strength and endurance, exploded inward in a cataclysmic shower of splintered metal and shattered stone. The way was open. Fenris stood in the gaping maw of the ruined gateway, his colossal form silhouetted against the stormy night. Blood, dark and smoking, dripped from the crack in his head, his golden eyes burning with a pain-fueled fire. He looked past the terrified soldiers, past the wreckage of his own making, his gaze settling on a lone figure standing in the main plaza. It was Odin, Gungnir, held ready in his hand. The outer defenses had fallen. The walls were breached. The champion was dead. Now, there was nothing left but the wolf and his king. The Citadel was a ruin. The Great Gate was a memory. In the Grand Plaza, littered with the debris of a fallen age and lit by the hungry flames of burning banners, the final act of the prophecy was set to play out. The few remaining Ethel defenders huddled behind shattered statues, their fight extinguished with the death of their champion. They were now merely witnesses to the end of their world. Between them and the apocalypse stood one man, Owen Alden. He held his spear, Gungnir, its light the only star of hope in a sky of despair. Fenris stood opposite him, a creature of shadow and rage. Dark blood dripped from the glowing wound on his head, each drop sizzling on the cold stone. The pain had only focused him. His golden eyes, devoid of all mercy, were fixed on the man who had been his jailer, the man who had been his father's brother. There were no words, The time for diplomacy, for deception, for bargains was a lifetime ago. This was the final, brutal truth. Alden charged first. He was not a fool. He knew he could not match the wolf's strength. He had to rely on speed, on strategy, on a lifetime of combat knowledge. He moved like a phantom, using the wreckage of the plaza as cover, firing precise blasts from Gungnir that forced the wolf to turn, to react. He aimed for the wound Mason had created, and one blast struck true, causing Fenrir to roar in agony. For a moment, it seemed the old king's skill might just be enough. But Fenrir was a force of nature, and you cannot outweed an avalanche. He ignored the pain, his rage a furnace that burned away all strategy. With a single, explosive leap, he crossed the plaza, shattering a century-old fountain in his path. The distance was closed. Cunning was no longer an option. Alden stood his ground. He saw the wolf's jaws, wide enough to swallow the sky, descending upon him. He saw the prophecy, the crimson thread that had haunted his entire life, reaching its violent conclusion. In his final moment, he did not cower. He was a king, with a final war cry for his lost son, for his fallen champion, for his dying city. He thrust Gungnir upwards, one last defiant act against the inevitable. The spear, powered by the last of Alden's life force, drove deep into the wolf's throat. It was a mortal wound, but it was not enough. In the same instant, the great jaws snapped shut. The sound of a king's armor, the strongest in all the citadel, crunching like dry leaves, was the last sound the Ethel heard. Gungnir clattered to the ground, its light extinguished. The Allfather, the great chairman, the guardian of order, was gone. The prophecy was fulfilled. Fenrir stood over the fallen king, the glowing spear embedded deep in his throat, his own lifeblood now pouring onto the stones. His vengeance was complete, but the price was grievous. He let out a ragged, wounded roar, a sound of both triumph and agony. He turned his burning eyes, now flickering with pain, toward the huddled survivors. His purpose was fulfilled, but his rage was not yet spent. As he took a step forward, a lone figure walked out from behind the wreckage to stand before him. He was unarmed. His face was grim, his posture weary. On his right arm, a metallic prosthetic gleamed in the firelight. Fenrir. The voice was quiet, hoarse, but it cut through the wolf's haze of pain and fury. Fenrir stopped. He knew that voice. He knew that scent. It was a scent of loyalty, of duty, and of a betrayal so old it felt like a different lifetime. It was Tyler. The great wolf looked down at the one-handed man. He saw no fear in Tyler's eyes, only a profound, bottomless sorrow. Tyler was not looking at the monster that had destroyed their world. He was looking at the friend he had been forced to betray. In that moment, Tyler was not a soldier defending a city. He was a man mourning a loss that had two victims. The rage in Fenris's eyes faltered. The fire of his vengeance, having consumed its primary target, was now met not with defiance, but with regret. He stood there, panting, bleeding, the body of his greatest enemy at his feet, and was now faced with the living memory of his oldest friend. The great prophecy was finished. The king was dead. The twilight had come. But as the wolf and the one-handed man stood facing each other in the ruins of the world, a new, unwritten question hung in the air. The great war ended not with a bang, but with a moment of profound, sorrowful silence. The wounded wolf, Fenrir, and the one-handed man, Tyler, stood in the ruins of the plaza, the body of a dead king lying between them. The fire of vengeance in Fenris's eyes, which had burned hot enough to consume a civilization, was now met with the cold, clear sorrow in Tyler's. In that gaze, something ancient passed between them. A memory, perhaps, of a biodome and a gentle hand, a trust that existed long before prophecies and betrayals had poisoned the world. The fire in the great wolf's eyes did not extinguish. It simply receded, pulled back into a deep, private darkness. His vengeance was complete. His purpose was fulfilled. His hatred, the fuel that had sustained him for a lifetime, was finally spent. Slowly, painfully, with the glowing spear of his enemies still embedded in his throat, Fenrir turned. He did not give the cowering survivors a second glance. He limped past the broken body of Captain Mason, through the shattered remains of the Great Gate, and out into the wilderness. The remaining Ethel watched as his colossal form disappeared into the snow-swept mountains, a trail of dark blood marking his final journey. The great beast was going off to find a quiet place to die, his role in the saga over. Tyler stood for a long moment, watching the space where the wolf had been, before turning back to the ruins of his home. The survivors began to emerge from the rubble, their faces pale and shell-shocked in the flickering firelight. They were few, they were cold, they were utterly alone. Their king was dead, their champion fallen, their city a powerless, frozen tomb. They had survived the twilight, but now they faced the long, cold night that followed. And what of the architect of it all? Miles away, in a hidden sanctuary of humming servers and glowing screens, Lucas watched his victory. He saw the citadel go dark. He learned of his brother's death. He had won. His revenge for the binding of his son was absolute. But as he looked at the dead network feeds and the silent communication channels, the triumph felt hollow, turning to ash in his mouth. His serpent was dead. His daughter Helena's army of the damned was inert. Fenrir, his greatest son, was gone. He had torn down his brother's house, but now stood alone in the rubble, a king of nothing. Back in the citadel, a new leader was not chosen, but simply emerged. Tyler, the man of quiet duty, took charge. There were no grand speeches, no claims to a throne. There were only practical, necessary words. We need warmth. We need food. We need to count our dead. They gathered in the great hall, the site of so many proud ceremonies. They stripped the broken furniture and ancient tapestries and built a great bonfire in the center of the floor. For the first time in centuries, the Ethel huddled together for warmth, not from the hum of a perfect machine, but from the primal, living flames of a real fire. As the first, weak light of a cold dawn crept through the shattered ceiling, Tyler walked to the ruined gateway and looked out. The sun rose over the jagged peaks, its light touching the snow-covered ruins of his home. It was a new day. The age of the Ethel, of their power, their secrets, and their terrible prophecies, was over. They were no longer gods in a hidden sanctuary. They were simply survivors. The twilight had been an end, but every end is also a beginning. They had lost their grandeur, but they had also been freed from the chains of a fate they had tried so desperately to control. The great story, the one that had been written for them in the threads of prophecy, was finished. Now their own story, the one they would write for themselves with their own hands, day by difficult day, could finally begin. 3 days. For 3 days, a profound silence reigned over the ruins of the citadel. The fires in the Grand Plaza had died out, leaving blackened scars on the ornate stone. Outside the shattered gates, the frozen armies of the valiant and the damned stood as a silent, grotesque testament to an age that had ended in an instant. The only sounds were the mournful whistle of the wind through broken towers and the quiet, desperate murmurs of the survivors. The shock had worn off, replaced by the gnawing, relentless enemies of hunger and cold. The great bonfire in the main hall was their only bastion of warmth, but their fuel, priceless wooden furniture, ancient tapestries, books containing a millennium of knowledge, was dwindling fast. They were a few hundred survivors in a city built for tens of thousands, ghosts haunting the cold, dark corpse of their world. In this new, brutal reality, Tyler had become their center of gravity. He was not a king who gave rousing speeches. He was an anchor of quiet competence. His days were a blur of practical, necessary tasks, organizing scavenging parties for ration packs, directing the construction of insulated shelters within the more intact chambers, and rationing their dwindling power packs for light. His prosthetic hand, once a symbol of a tragic sacrifice, was now just another tool, useful for clearing heavy rubble and never growing numb from the biting cold. "We can't stay here," he announced on the third evening, his voice cutting through the exhausted quiet of the great hall. "The upper levels are a frozen tomb. We'll freeze to death before we starve. We need to go deeper. Underground. The geothermal heat from the mountain might offer some protection." There were grumbles of dissent, voices of despair arguing that moving was pointless. But most looked at Tyler, at his steady gaze and tireless work, and found a reason to keep going. The next morning, he formed small exploration teams to scout the lower levels, searching for defensible locations and any forgotten caches of supplies. One such team was led by a young engineer named Alara. She was armed with one of the last functional handheld scanners and a stubborn optimism that had somehow survived the twilight. For hours, they navigated the pitch-black corridors of the Citadel sublevels, their world defined by the narrow beams of their light sticks. "Wait," Alara whispered, stopping dead. "I'm getting something." On her scanner, a tiny, impossibly faint energy signature flickered. It was minuscule, not even enough to power a single light panel, but it was there. It's deep, and it's stable. Following the faint signal, they journeyed deeper than most of them had ever been, to a section of the citadel that had been sealed off decades ago, labeled only as Bioresearch Outpost Gamma. The door was massive and airtight. It took the team an hour to manually override the lock. As the heavy door hissed open, a wave of warm, humid air washed over them. Inside, the lights were on. The air hummed with a gentle thrum of life support and water purifiers. They had found a forgotten pocket of the old world, a small research station powered by its own independent geothermal vent. In the center of the main biosphere, under brilliant grow lights, were rows upon rows of thriving plants in hydroponic bays. It was food. It was water. It was warmth. It was a miracle. Tears of relief streamed down Alara's face as she stared at the impossible garden. For the first time in days, there was a flicker of genuine hope. As the others explored the small station, marveling at their discovery, Alara found herself drawn to a single, still active terminal in the station's command center. Unlike the others, this console was a long-range communications array, pointed not inward at the citadel, but outward at the vast, empty world beyond. On its screen, a single message was being received, repeating on a loop. It was not from the citadel's dead network. It was coming from somewhere else entirely. It was a simple string of text, a set of coordinates, pointing to a desolate location in the vast deserts on the other side of the continent, followed by 3 chilling words. A question that seemed to mock their newfound hope. It read, "Was it worth it?" The news brought back by Alara's team hit the huddled survivors in the Great Hall in 2 distinct waves. First came a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. The revelation of the biolab, a warm, lit, self-sustaining sanctuary with food and clean water, was a miracle of the highest order. For the first time in days, the suffocating despair lifted. Tears were shed, not of grief, but of profound relief. They were not going to die in the cold and the dark. They had been given a future. They named it Sanctuary. Then, Alara delivered the second piece of news. She projected a faint image from her scanner onto a soot-stained wall, the coordinates, and the 3 chilling words that accompanied them. Was it worth it? A cold silence fell over the hall, snuffing out the brief warmth of their hope. The question, dripping with a familiar, cruel irony, could have come from only one person. Lucas, a survivor whispered, and the name spread through the crowd like a virus of fear. The community, so briefly united in joy, was now fractured by a debate born of terror and desperation. "It's a trap," shouted a grim-faced man, his arm in a sling. "He destroyed our world, killed our champion, and now he wants to finish the job. He's luring us out into the wastes to die." "But what if he isn't?" countered a young woman, her face thin with hunger. "What if it's a message of surrender? Or an offer of help? We can't survive here forever. This sanctuary is a reprieve, not a salvation. We have to know what's out there." Tyler listened to it all, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. He saw the logic in both arguments. His mind, trained in security and strategy, screamed that this was a trap. Lucas was the master of deception, the architect of their ruin. Yet, as a leader, he knew their long-term position was untenable. The sanctuary could support them for months, maybe a year, but it was still a cage. To truly live, they had to engage with the world outside their mountain. He let the arguments rage for a time, gauging the will of his people. He saw how easily their newfound hope could curdle back into fear. Alden would have made a decree, a command based on his own certainty. But Tyler had seen where Alden's certainty had led them. Finally, he stepped forward, and the hall fell silent. "We will not be fools," he said, his voice calm and steady. "And we will not be cowards. We will not risk the lives of everyone on the word of a ghost. But we will not cower in the dark and wait for our end, either." He outlined his plan, a compromise born of caution and necessity. The first priority is survival. We will all move to the sanctuary. We will make it our home, fortify it, and begin the work of rebuilding. But we will not ignore this message. He looked around the room, his gaze firm. "I will lead a small scouting party, 3 people. We will travel to these coordinates. We will assess the situation. And if it is a trap, the loss will be small. But if it is a chance, it is one we must be willing to take." There were murmurs, but no one argued. The plan was sound. Tyler chose his team carefully. He chose Alara for her technical skill and her unwavering optimism, a quality they desperately needed. For his third, he chose a grizzled former security officer named Hel, a cynical pragmatist who had seen the worst of the final battle and survived. He was a skilled fighter and a man who would not be easily fooled. Leader, optimist, and realist. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. The survivors were located, a somber procession carrying their few belongings and their wounded into the warmth and light of the sanctuary. It was a strange, emotional moment, finding a new home in the foundations of their old one. While they settled in, Tyler, Alara, and Hel prepared for their journey. They gathered the best of what was left: insulated survival gear, long-lasting power packs, a handful of functioning energy rifles, and a single, battered land speeder they had managed to get running on emergency power cells. On the morning of their departure, Tyler stood with his team before the shattered Great Gate. Behind them, in the depths of the mountain, was the sound of a community coming back to life. Before them, a vast, silent, snow-covered wilderness stretched to the horizon. They were leaving the last light of their world behind to follow a ghost's whisper into the dark. "Ready?" Tyler asked, his voice low. Alara nodded, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and excitement. Hel just grunted, checking the charge on his rifle one last time. Tyler took a final look back at the ruin of his home, then turned his face to the unknown. Let's go find out if it was worth it. The world outside the citadel was vast, silent, and broken. Their land speeder, a relic scavenged from a forgotten motor pool, skimmed over the frozen earth, its engines whining a constant complaint against the cold. Inside the cramped cockpit, the mood was a tense mixture of grim determination and nervous anticipation. Hel, the grizzled soldier, piloted the craft with an expert's touch, his eyes constantly scanning the desolate horizon. Alara monitored their dwindling power cells and the primitive navigation system, while Tyler sat between them, a silent, watchful leader. For the first few days, they traveled through the endless, snow-covered foothills of their mountain range. It was a land scrubbed clean of life. When they finally descended onto the Great Plains, the snow gave way to a cracked, frozen tundra. Here, they saw the first signs of the world that was the rusted, skeletal remains of great power lines. All of them collapsed, their cables lying like the sinews of dead giants. In the archives, this was the central grid, Alara said softly, her voice filled with a scholar's awe and sadness. It powered half the continent. I can't imagine the chaos when it failed. I can, Hel grunted without taking his eyes off the terrain. Chaos is simple. The lights go out. People get cold. Then they get hungry. Then they get mean. Their journey took them to the edge of what had once been a sprawling human city. They landed the speeder, conserving power, and explored the silent streets on foot. It was a haunting experience. It was not a city destroyed by war, but a city that had simply stopped breathing. Vehicles clogged the roads, their doors left open. In a sterile high-rise, they found half-eaten meals on tables in a corporate cafeteria. It was a city evacuated in a panic, a place abandoned by people who expected to return, but never did. The great cold wasn't just us, Tyler observed, his voice low as he looked out from a shattered window onto the frozen metropolis. When our core died, it didn't just kill the citadel, it broke the world. They found no bodies, but they found evidence of the riots and the desperation Hel had predicted. They were strangers walking through the tomb of a civilization they had never known, yet whose end they had inadvertently caused. The weight of that unintended consequence settled heavily upon them. Pressing on, they left the frozen city behind and entered the great desert. The cold relented slightly, replaced by a vast, empty expanse of sand and rock under a pale, unforgiving sun. Their journey became a race against their failing power cells. The navigation marker, the ghost's coordinates, was a blinking in a sea of nothing. We're almost there, Alara announced, her voice tight with tension. But the power cells are critical. We have enough for maybe another hour of travel, not enough to get back. It was a one-way trip. When they finally arrived, their hearts sank. The coordinates led to the center of a vast, flat, salt basin. There was nothing. No structure, no wreckage, no sign of life. Just the wind and the endless, cracked earth. A joke, Hel spat, his face a mask of disgust. He brought us all the way out here to die. A final twist of the knife. Alera's optimism finally broke. She slumped in her seat, the reality of their foolish, hopeful quest crashing down on her. Tyler felt a cold knot of failure tighten in his stomach. He had risked his team, their only vehicle, on a whisper, and it had led to this empty grave. As Kale prepared to turn the speeder around for the hopeless journey back, Alera's scanner, which she had left running, let out a sharp, unexpected ping. "Wait," she gasped, her eyes wide. "That's not a radio signal. It's a particle emission. High energy. And it's not coming from the horizon." She looked at the display, her brow furrowed in confusion. "It's coming from directly below us." Tyler's head snapped up. He looked out at the empty basin, his strategic mind racing. It wasn't a point on a map. It was a marker. As he searched the ground, he saw it. A set of faint markings on the salt flats, almost invisible, forming a complex geometric pattern around their speeder. They hadn't just arrived at the coordinates. They had parked on the trigger. As if on cue, a low hum vibrated up from the ground beneath them. The earth trembled, and the geometric markings began to glow with a soft, blue light. With a hiss of perfectly engineered machinery, a huge section of the desert floor in front of them retracted, sliding away to reveal a wide, smooth ramp descending into darkness. A moment later, the ramp and the cavernous entrance below were flooded with cool, clean, white light. From the opening, a soft breeze of climate-controlled air washed over them. It was the entrance to a subterranean facility of impossible scale and technology. It was not a destination. It was an invitation. They stared in stunned silence down the illuminated throat of the bunker, the lair of the man who had destroyed their world. Their choice was simple and terrible: turn back and die in the desert, or accept the invitation and walk into the heart of the trap. There was no real choice.
To stay in the desert was to die.
With a shared, grim look, Tyler, Alera, and Kale guided the failing land speeder down the brilliantly lit ramp. The massive door hissed shut behind them, sealing them in, cutting off the dying world and their past. The air inside was cool, clean, and carried the faint scent of ozone and vegetation. They abandoned the speeder at the bottom of the ramp. The tunnel opened into a silent, cavernous transit hub. The technology was seamless, elegant, and leagues beyond the functional, almost brutalist, design of the Citadel. Before they could decide on a course of action, the floor beneath them glowed, and a silent, automated transport pod rose to meet them. There were no words, but the invitation was clear. With Kale's hand resting nervously on his rifle, they stepped aboard. The pod accelerated into the darkness, a smooth, silent journey deep into the earth. They passed through caverns containing colossal water filtration systems, geothermal power conduits that glowed with contained energy, and server farms that dwarfed the Citadel's Hall of Heroes. It was a facility of unimaginable scale, all of it pristine, all of it utterly silent. Then, they emerged into the light. The team gasped in unison. They were in a vast, central cavern, so large that the ceiling was lost in a soft haze. And projected onto that ceiling was a perfect, artificial sky, complete with a gently warming sun and slow-drifting clouds. Below them lay a paradise. Lush forests, sparkling rivers, and fields of strange, beautiful flora stretched as far as the eye could see. It was another sanctuary, but one that made their own hidden biolab look like a potted plant. Yet, for all its beauty, it was profoundly empty. There were no people, no animals, only the quiet hum of a perfect, lonely machine. "Welcome, survivors," a voice echoed through the vast space. It was calm, resonant, and unmistakably Lucas. It was not the voice of a taunting trickster, but of a weary host. "I imagine you have questions. Please come to the observatory." A path of light formed on the ground before them, guiding them through the artificial paradise to a spire of white stone at its center. They found him in a minimalist chamber at the top of the spire, a single, curved window looking out over his creation. Lucas looked older than they remembered, the lines of his face carved deeper by time, and something that looked like sorrow. He was no longer a rogue agent of chaos, but a quiet king in an empty kingdom. Kale raised his rifle. "This is it then? The final trap?" Lucas offered a faint, sad smile. "The traps are all sprung, soldier. The game is over." He turned from the window. "You came seeking answers. The first is why? Why destroy our world?" He gestured to the perfect landscape below. "Because it was a gilded cage, built on the fear of a single, flawed prophecy. Owen was so obsessed with preventing the end that he created a world that had forgotten how to live. I did not destroy our world. I merely broke the cage. Its own internal rot did the rest. You murdered his son, Tyler said, his voice cold. I did, Lucas admitted, his gaze unflinching. And it was a monstrous act, a necessary one. Blaine was the symbol of Owen's perfect, sterile order. To break the system, the symbol had to fall. It was the price of freedom. Freedom? Alara asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and confusion. Look at the world above. It's dead. What was the point? That, Lucas said, a flicker of his old fire returning, is the second answer. He touched a control panel, and the great window became a screen, displaying schematics of the entire facility. This is not my fortress.
It is in Arkansas.
For decades, while Owen was pruning and purifying the Ethel, I was collecting. Every strain of plant he deemed imperfect, every animal species he labeled chaotic, every line of academic thought he banned as destabilizing. It is all here, the complete, unfiltered genetic and cultural heritage of our people and of this planet. I preserved everything my brothers sought to erase. The team stared, stunned into silence. This was not the act of a nihilist. It was the work of a radical preservationist. I orchestrated the twilight, yes, Lucas continued. I brought about the end of the Age of Alden. Now, I intend to begin the Age of Rebirth. But I am a keeper of seeds, not a gardener. I am alone here. He looked directly at Tyler, his gaze piercing. That is why you are here. I offer you and the other survivors a choice. The Citadel is a tomb. This place is a cradle. I am offering you a new world. He paused, letting the weight of his offer settle. Join me. Your people can live here, in safety and comfort. We can use the resources of this ark to begin the long, slow process of healing the world above. But there is a condition. You must abandon the old ways of the Ethel, the obsession with purity, the fear of change, the slavery to prophecy. You must embrace new ideas. You must be willing to become something more than what you were. Tyler, Alara, and Kale stood on a balcony overlooking the silent, perfect forest, the weight of the impossible choice pressing down on them. Their enemy had offered them not death, but salvation, a future. But to accept it, they would have to bury their past and place their trust in the hands of the fallen god who had caused all their suffering. The silence that followed Lucas's offer was heavier than any they had yet endured. They retreated to the guest quarters they had been given, rooms of simple, elegant comfort, and the debate began. It was a clash of worldviews, a battle for the soul of the Ethel. We cannot trust him, Kale stated, his voice a low, angry growl. He paced the room like a caged animal. Every word he speaks is a potential lie. This isn't a cradle, it's a cage, just a warmer one than the Citadel. We'll be his pets, his subjects. He'll offer us the world, and then, when we are dependent on him, the true price will be revealed. I would rather die a free man in the cold than live as a king in his prison. Die for what, Kale? Alara shot back, her hands clenched. For pride? For a memory? The Ethel you're talking about died with Alden. We are a few hundred starving people. We have a duty to them, a duty to survive. He has the tools, the knowledge, the resources to give our children a future. Are we supposed to throw that away because of old hatreds? He murdered our people,
Kale roared.
and our people created the monster that killed them. Alara retorted, her voice cracking with emotion. Alden's obsession, his purity, it led us to ruin. Lucas is offering us a different path. Maybe it's time we were brave enough to take it. Tyler listened, his face impassive, his mind a storm. He heard the truth in both arguments. Kale was right to distrust. Lucas's hands were stained with the blood of their people. But Alara was right that their old ways were a dead end. He thought of Fenrir, a life destroyed by the Ethel's fear of the imperfect. He thought of Alden, a great man enslaved and ultimately consumed by a prophecy he refused to defy. He knew he could not make this decision without one more piece of information. Leaving his team to their debate, he sought out Lucas, finding him again in the observatory. Before we can even consider your offer, Tyler said, his voice level. I have a question. What happens if we refuse? We are stranded here. Do you let us starve? Do you kill us for defying you? Lucas looked at Tyler, and for the first time, his expression was completely devoid of irony or weariness. It was one of genuine respect. That is the question a true leader would ask, he said softly. And the answer is no. This is not a negotiation under duress. A choice made in a cage is not a choice at all. If you refuse, I will fully recharge your land speeder. I will give you enough supplies for a month. You will be free to return to your mountain, to your sanctuary. The offer to join us will remain open, should you change your minds. That was the final piece. It was an act of good faith, an offer of true freedom. It was something Alden, in his certainty, would never have done. Tyler returned to his team. I've made a decision, he announced, and they fell silent. We will accept, but not as his subjects. We will be his partners. He laid out his terms. They would maintain their own council, with him as its head. They would share knowledge and resources, but they would not be ruled. They would help rebuild the world, but they would do so as a free people, forging a new identity from the ashes of the old. It was not submission. It was an alliance. Kale was still skeptical, but he saw the wisdom in Tyler's leadership. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. Alera's face was filled with a brilliant, fragile hope. Using the Ark's long-range comms, Tyler opened a channel to the Citadel. He spoke to his people, his voice echoing in the cold, dark halls of their former home. He told them everything, of the Ark, of Lucas, of the impossible offer, and of his decision. He did not command them. He invited them to join in building a new world. The response was a chaotic, emotional wave of sound across the comms, disbelief, fear, arguments, and then, rising above it all, a powerful current of hope. The vote was nearly unanimous. They would come. Later that evening, Tyler stood on the observatory balcony, the warm, artificial breeze on his face. Lucas joined him, and for a long time, they stood in silence, watching the fabricated sun set over their shared, empty paradise. You made the right choice, Lucas said finally. The migration will be difficult, but it is the first step. The first step of what? Tyler asked. Lucas's gaze grew distant, looking out at his perfect world. Rebuilding is always harder than breaking, he said, his voice taking on a new, unsettling gravity. And you should know, Tyler, in the great silence left by the twilight, you and I are not the only survivors out there. The transports that arrived at the Citadel were not war machines, but vessels of passage. They were silent, graceful things, sent by Lucas to ferry the last children of Alden away from their ancestral home. The migration was a somber, silent affair. Each survivor took one last look at the frozen, broken towers, at the silent statues of the fallen armies, at the great hall where they had once celebrated a golden age. They were leaving behind a city of ghosts, carrying only their memories and a fragile, uncertain hope. Their arrival at the Ark was the inverse of their departure. They emerged from the transports not into a cold, dead ruin, but into a world of impossible life. They were greeted by the scent of rich earth and clean water, by the warmth of a perfect sun on their faces, by the sight of a forest stretching to the horizon of their new world. For the first time, the survivors of the Twilight wept not in sorrow, but in overwhelming, cathartic relief. Their long winter was over. In the days that followed, a new society began to form, not from dogma or prophecy, but from necessity. A provisional council was established, led by Tyler, but with the pragmatic voice of Kale, the hopeful innovation of Alera, and, in an advisory role, the disquieting wisdom of Lucas. Their first official act was not to write laws or build defenses, but to make a promise. We cannot forget the world above, Tyler declared at their first council meeting. We cannot make the same mistake of hiding from it. Our future is not in this perfect cage, but in using it to heal the world we broke. Their first project was symbolic. They would take a sapling, a young, resilient world tree from the Ark's most treasured collection, and plant it on the surface, the first seed of a new beginning. Before they ascended, Tyler sought out Lucas one last time, needing an answer to the question that had haunted him since their arrival. You said we weren't the only ones. Who else is out there? Lucas stood before the great window, a silhouette against his perfect, artificial world. The fall of the Citadel's core was not a quiet event, he explained. It sent a shockwave through the very fabric of the planet, a silent, global announcement that the age of the Ethel was over. That kind of silence creates a vacuum. It awakens things that have been sleeping. Other groups, hidden like we were. Factions of humanity who survived the chaos and are now forging new societies in the ruins. Perhaps even older things, beings from tales the Ethel dismissed as primitive myths. The world is now a blank page, Tyler, and many hands will rush to write upon it. With this new, sobering knowledge, the small council took the sapling to the surface. They emerged from the ramp into the harsh, beautiful light of a desert sunset. The air was thin and cold, but it was real. Using the ark's technology, they prepared a small patch of earth, enriching it, watering it. Together, the four of them planted the young tree in the barren soil. They stood for a moment, looking at the fragile sapling, a tiny speck of defiant life in a vast, empty world. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts. Kale, the soldier, scanned the horizon, his hand never far from his weapon, his duty to protect this new hope absolute. Alara, the builder, saw not just a tree, but the first node in a new ecosystem, her mind already racing with plans. Lucas, the catalyst, watched with the quiet satisfaction of a philosopher whose grand, chaotic experiment was finally underway. And Tyler, the leader, looked at the small tree and felt the immense weight of the past and the terrifying, exhilarating promise of the future. The prophecy was fulfilled. The cycle was broken. They were no longer characters in a story written by fate. The age of gods was over. The age of monsters was over. The great fire had burned their world to the ground, but here, in the ashes, a single, tiny ember of life was beginning to glow. The age of embers had begun.